Hey yo, what is good YouTube? Who was that guy that's back with another video? And in this one, I just want to have a quick follow-up to my video because about a month ago, I made a Sabbath class regarding authenticating Paul as a legitimate apostle. All right, but here in my studies and my Bible studies, I think there's actually some more stuff that actually reflects that. And the root thing of this is the fact that when they actually begin to study ancient Israel, which is something that I think the church should do, which is something I think the black community should do, there is a lot of principles from the promised land, from the ancient promised land, that when we bring them in a day-to-day life now, it shifts the way we think about a lot of things. So with that perspective in mind, we could actually look at the Apostle Paul and see how much he's actually consistent with the principles of ancient Israel. So the arguments that people use to try to discredit Paul actually show to authenticate Paul, not for the sake of just being some random Paul supporter, but for a matter of actually looking at the principles and saying that the Apostle Paul is consistent with them. And since the Apostle Paul, when we study his writings, is consistent with the Jerusalem elders and is consistent with these principles from the ancient Israelites, which is his people, the natural conclusion is that Paul is a legitimate apostle. All right. So one of the arguments that people say that I've seen is that they claim that Paul allowed churches to eat meat, eat foods that sacrifice to idols, which is actually not true. That's cap. Because when you look at the book of Acts in chapter 15, we see how the Jerusalem elders and Jerusalem apostles, who are among the first believers, actually write to some of the churches in Asia Minor, some of the assemblies, and tell them not to eat food sacrificed to idols. But when we read the very next chapter in Acts 16, we actually see that the Apostle Paul was one of the messengers who went and sent that message. Before he was called to go to Macedonia, the Apostle Paul was one of the messengers to deliver that message, meaning the Apostle Paul fully agreed with and co-signed the message of the Jerusalem elders that said that eating food sacrificed to idols is wrong. And people forget Acts 16 when they try to bring up this argument. So, when we dive into it, before we ever get to Corinthians, which is Paul's own body writing on the subject of food sacrificed to idols, we see he already agreed with the earliest apostles and followers of Jesus in Jerusalem, the Hebrews, that eating food sacrificed to idols is wrong. Now, when we read 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it becomes clear that the Apostle Paul has a problem with eating food sacrificed to idols. We read in verse 21 that we cannot drink from the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. So, in other words, you can't be sitting at the table of God and at the table of devils at the same time. You have to pick a side, right? Sort of like how Christ said you can't serve God and money, you can't serve God and demons. We can get right into this because in the verse beforehand, the Apostle Paul is actually quoting Deuteronomy 32:17. And the Hebrew manuscript in Deuteronomy that gets translated as demon or daemon in Hebrew is shadim. And the word shadim has the context of like territorial entities. Now, Dr. Michael Heiser has studied some of this in his book called The Unseen Realm, which I've been reading, which means all that is to say, the Old Testament has this idea of territorial spirits, territorial entities. These are the so-called gods of the nations that are wrongly being worshipped. So the idea is, now as the gospel is spreading and these nations are actually being reclaimed to the God of Zion, let's not partake in the things of the Lord with these territorial entities that are wrongly being worshipped, all right? We're not going to participate in their sacrifices and their altars and that wickedness. No, we're going to be saints in exile, right? Like how the children of Israel were exiled in Babylon, but they kept their hearts right for God. In a similar way, even when we're in Babylon, let's not follow these other gods and keep our hearts for God and for the Christ that he revealed. That's sort of the idea. So the idea is no getting involved with idolatrous practices, pagan practices, actually going to those pagan temples, all right? No sitting at the table of demons, only sitting at the table of the Lord. The Apostle Paul says that, so clearly he's against actually going and participating in pagan temples, which is the act where you would be eating food sacrificed to idols. Listen, the Apostle Paul in verse 14 directly says to flee from idolatry. So you can't be supporting idolatry or have any types of idolatrous practices when you outright reject idolatry in any pure form. You see what I'm saying? So when you start reading Paul's stuff, he's against idolatry. He's against interacting with, embracing pagan elements of the culture. Now, at the same time, what he does do is he draws a distinction between actually participating in a pagan sacrifice in a pagan temple and buying meat from a meat market. Because in those times, there would be a piece of meat, right? People would take some of it for their pagan sacrifice, and then they would sell the rest of the meat to the market. And the question is, all right, we serve the true God now. Is it bad for us to buy the rest of the meat from the market when some of it was used for a pagan temple? And the Apostle Paul says, no, that's cool. All right? So we already know he's against idolatry and against actually participating in the temples. The distinction is between that and actually eating meat that may have been sacrificed by some random people to an idol. That is not wrong in itself. That's what 1 Corinthians 10 is getting at. All right, but the principle of this actually extends back to the Old Testament, and it's something that we often neglect. It's one obscure verse in the book of Judges, but this gives us a whole total framework shift when it comes to these issues, because what it shows is that the saints directly have the right to repurpose pagan things, repurpose pagan objects, repurpose directly pagan things for the true God. So we're not to embrace paganism or idolatry or pagan practices of the nations. What we do have the right to do is, when we're in the culture that we're in, actually take those things and be able to repurpose them for the true God. We see this all over the Old Testament, but very clearly in the book of Judges. So before I get there, let me get into the Apostle Paul's mind a little bit, and I just want to read this verse. 1 Corinthians 10:25, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For, quote, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So Paul, who is himself an Israelite from the tribe of Benjamin by birth, he rejects idolatry, he rejects serving any other god, but he allows the Corinthians to eat whatever is sold in the market if their conscience is not defiled, if their conscience is not convicted. Why? Because after all, the true creator made everything. So if some perverted cats, if some perverted weirdos use something the true God made for a pagan practice or a pagan sacrifice, you are not yoked to that. You're not yoked to pagan people perverting what the true God has made anyway. So let them do what they're going to do. But you have the right to use this, to use something that the original God made in the first place for the right purpose, for the right service. You see what I'm saying? So this is the way the Apostle Paul is thinking, that, yo, God made everything. So just because some people may use a piece of meat or a piece of chicken or whatever, piece of cow in a pagan sacrifice, if you want to buy the rest of the meat in the market to feed your family, that's not a problem, because we know what God your allegiance is towards. And when we actually break stuff down, we see how much Paul really was an Israelite and how much he really knew his Old Testament, because these are principles that come from the Bible and verses that are typically very obscure. Let me put it to you this way. You have a bunch of wood. You can either use it to make an altar to Asherah or an altar to the true God of Zion. Let me read this verse in Judges 6:26. Now this is when Gideon was raised up as a man of God, as one of the judges. And basically there's a lot of paganism going right down, and he's tearing down all the pagan altars and he's making altars of God. So when Gideon was destroying the pagan altars, pick up in verse 26, God says, and build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of the stronghold here with stones laid in due order. Then take the second bull and offer as a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah that you shall cut down. So God is saying, make an altar, take a bull, and offer the bull with the wood that you just cut down from the pagan altar. Gideon, the man of God, destroys the pagan altars and uses the same wood to make an altar for God. The same exact wood. Does that make him pagan? Far be it from me, far be it from him. The God, that the true God sanctioned this. So what this means is this is an explicit principle that comes from the ancient Israelite community, that we can see that when they were doing their thing, especially when they were counteracting paganism of their nations and pagan gods, the saints actually had the right, with the sanction of God to directly repurpose pagan things for the true God. He took the wood of a pagan altar and used that same wood, that same so-called unclean wood, to make an altar to God, and it was totally sanctioned. God told him to do this. And this, see, when you understand spiritual warfare, it's a different framework. I think a lot of people who believe in God and who, believe in Christ, who are in the church, have a sort of sissified framework when it comes to paganism and interacting with paganism. Because a lot of people see something pagan and it's like their balls drop off and they're like, and they run away. What we will have to do, that what the saints have the right to do, is actually a more aggressive mindset, a more zealous mindset, where we actually interact with the culture and use things that the culture already has in place, be able to repurpose them for the true God. Because this stuff with Gideon isn't an isolated incident. We can look all throughout the history of the Israelites. We can look at the way the tribe of Levi moved and the house of Zadok moved after the Old Testament was finished. I'm going to have a whole video on that later on. So we have a whole history of this before it becomes an explicit principle in the New Testament with the apostles of the Messiah. All right. But beforehand, this is something that the saints have always been doing. Because just as scripture makes it clear in the book of Deuteronomy that we have to stay away from wicked practices of the nations, we have the right to actually engage the culture and repurpose pagan things for the true God. When you understand that God is reclaiming territory from these false gods that are wrongly worshipped, then you're actually seeing anytime this pagan altar is transformed into an altar of God, or this pagan temple is converted into a church, that's spiritual territory being taken back for the true God. See, y'all don't realize, people don't realize, but this is the framework you gotta operate in. It's territory that was once used to worship pagan gods being brought back for the true God. You see what I'm saying? It's a whole different attitude. It's a whole framework shift. God is reclaiming what is rightfully his. Think about the house of Dagon. When the Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant and put it in their temple, the pagan statue of the god of Dagon actually crumbled in such a way that it was prostrating itself before the Ark of the Covenant. So now it's like God, Yah, is taken over and has made this pagan temple his residence. Y'all get the idea? So it's like we have the true God. We have a point when the nations went astray. So when we interact with culture and cause to operate in such a way that their holidays and their customs and their altars and their temples are now dedicated to the true God, that is honoring his name. When we generally repurpose pagan things for God, because God made everything anyway. So let's use this stuff that people use once wickedly to honor the true God. This is all over the Old Testament. So when we have this in mind, when we get to the Apostle Paul, he's actually agreeing with this ancient Hebrew principle. His mind is everything is made by God. So if some people in these societies are using what God made for pagan reasons, we have the right to repurpose that for, being able to feed our families or what have you. So if some people sacrifice a piece of meat to a pagan god or goddess and they sell the rest of it in the meat market, you don't have to feel condemned for going to that meat market and buying that, or feel that you're sinning against the true God, because the saints have the right to repurpose things that have once been used for wickedness. If Gideon can take a pagan altar and use the same wood to make an altar to the true God, how much more do we have the right to use a piece of meat that some random people took and used to honor their pagan God, when the true God is the one that made it? Y'all may not honor the true God, and y'all can do whatever wickedness you want, but I honor the true God, and I'm trying to feed my family. So I don't co-sign or I'm yoked to anything you wicked people are doing. God made this chicken, let's say. So if y'all take a chicken leg and want to sacrifice it to your God, that doesn't mean I can't use the rest of the chicken to feed my family. Y'all get the idea? So Paul is against eating at the table of demons, which would be actually going into the temples and participating with the wickedness. When he's dealing with the Corinthian assembly, he's basically saying there's a difference between that and just going to a meat market and getting your meat. And the difference is a principle that comes from the ancient Israelite community. When you look at the case of men like Gideon, this is something that has been firmly established by the saints. So I just want to make a quick follow-up sometimes I think we have such a desire to be consecrated, which is a good thing, whether it be like the church in general or people who specifically take on a Hebrew identity or a Jewish identity in the Messiah. And I got all the love and respect for that. But there's a whole lot of principles that we don't keep in mind. We have the right to repurpose paganism, y'all. Spiritual warfare is real, and we don't have the right mindset. All right. So I'm not saying go and do pagan stuff, but repurpose that pagan stuff for God. You're reclaiming territory for the true God, y'all. It's like we're really soldiers in the spiritual war trying to advance God's kingdom. This is a mindset that I think a lot of people in the church don't really have. So I think we got to get in tune with that. So when we understand that principle, we can repurpose pagan stuff. And the Apostle Paul is actually consistent with that when he says, all right, if you want to eat in the meat market, if your conscience is clear, don't feel condemned by God, because God is the true God that made the food anyway. That's consistent with how we see Gideon moved and was sanctioned by God how he moved. So I just want to make a quick video. I want to do a more in-depth video about all these different examples on its own category, but this is something that actually shows how consistent the entire Bible is, because people and prophets and men of God often go on a foundation that has already been laid. And we can actually see that the Apostle Paul really is embracing his Hebrew identity, because he knows his scriptures and he knows these principles that are often overlooked by many people in the church today. When we dig in deep, we actually see how consistent it is. So y'all be blessed in the Messiah. Y'all be blessed in the Most High God. And I'll see you in the next video. All right? Peace.